June 1942. The Pacific Ocean has become a graveyard. Japanese forces are crushing American positions across thousands of miles of ocean. But the real war is happening in the shadows, in the intercepted messages, in the broken codes. Every time American forces sent a message, Japanese code breakers were listening. And they were good. Terrifyingly good. The Japanese had cracked the American convoy codes. They'd broken the administrative ciphers. They knew troop movements before some American commanders did. Ships were being sunk. Marines were walking into ambushes. Men were dying because the enemy could read our mail. American cryptographers were in a desperate race against time, creating new codes only to watch them fall within weeks, sometimes days. But in the chaos of 1942, somewhere in the Pacific Theater, something impossible was happening. The Japanese intercepted a transmission unlike anything they'd ever heard. They threw everything at it. Their best minds, their most sophisticated techniques. Nothing worked. Because this wasn't a code that could be broken. It was a language that couldn't be learned. To understand how America found its unbreakable code, you need to understand two wars, one against an enemy overseas and one against its own people at home. The Pacific War was unlike anything the world had seen, island by island, jungle by jungle. Every battle a nightmare of heat, disease, and savage combat. And in this kind of warfare, communication was everything. You needed to call in artillery strikes, coordinate amphibious landings, request air support, all while under enemy fire. Seconds mattered, lives hung on every word, but speed meant nothing if the enemy heard everything you said. The military needed something impossible, a code that was both unbreakable and instant. No encryption machines, no code books that could be captured, something that could be spoken in the heat of battle without hesitation. But here's what makes this story almost unbearable in its irony. For decades, the United States government had waged a systematic campaign to erase Native American cultures. Kill the Indian, save the man. That was the official policy. Native children were ripped from their families and forced into boarding schools. Their hair was cut, their clothes were taken, and if they dared to speak their native language, they were beaten. Their mouths washed with soap, locked in basements, humiliated. The Navajo language, Diné, had survived Spanish conquistadors, Mexican rule, and American expansion. But it couldn't survive American education policy. By 1920, speaking Navajo in school was forbidden. The language was being strangled to death, one generation at a time. And then, the government that tried to kill that language realized it might be the one thing that could save them. The ultimate paradox, the ultimate injustice, the ultimate redemption. February 1942, Los Angeles. A 50-year-old civil engineer named Philip Johnston read about a Louisiana National Guard unit using Comanche soldiers for coded messages, and suddenly he had an idea that would change the war. But Johnston wasn't just any engineer. He was the son of missionaries who'd spent his childhood on the Navajo reservation. He'd grown up playing with Navajo children. He was one of the few non-Navajos who could actually speak the language fluently. And he knew something that almost no one in the military understood. The Navajo language wasn't just difficult, it was practically extraterrestrial. It had no alphabet, no written form most people could read. Its grammar worked completely differently from English, Japanese, or any other major language. It was tonal. The same word could have 4 different meanings depending on pitch. And here's the kicker. Fewer than 30 non-Navajos in the entire world could speak it fluently. Johnston rushed to Camp Elliott in San Diego. He demanded a meeting with Lieutenant Colonel James E. Jones, the area signal officer. Jones was skeptical. Hell, he was more than skeptical. He thought Johnston was wasting his time. They'd tried using native languages before. It hadn't worked. Languages could be learned. Linguists could be trained. And besides, how would you even say anti-aircraft gun or amphibious landing in a language that had no word for modern warfare? Johnston had an answer. Give me a chance to prove it. Let me bring in some Navajo men. Give us a demonstration. Jones agreed, probably just to get rid of him. By May 1942, Johnston had recruited 29 young Navajo men, the first 29th, teenagers and young men from the reservation, most of whom had been punished for speaking Navajo just years before. They were brought to Camp Elliott for a test that would determine everything. Marine officers fed them a typical military message, the kind of thing you'd send during battle: artillery coordinates, troop movements, strategic orders. The Navajos translated it into their language, transmitted it, received it, translated it back. A message that would take hours to encode and decode with a machine, they did it in seconds, perfectly. The observers were stunned. The cryptography experts were baffled. Within weeks, the Marine Corps approved a pilot program for Navajo communication specialists. They didn't know it yet, but they'd just found the code that would help win the war. The code that could never be broken. Because it was never just a code. It was a living language, spoken by warriors whose ancestors had defended this land for 1,000 years. And now, they would defend it again. By 1945, more than 400 Navajo Code Talkers would serve in the Pacific. The Japanese never broke their code, not once. The Marine Corps had their answer. Now they needed an army. By the fall of 1942, recruiters were fanning out across the Navajo Nation. 27,000 square miles of high desert mesas and canyon lands. They were looking for young men who could speak fluent Navajo and English, men who could handle the most brutal training the military had to offer. What they found were teenagers, some as young as 15, lying about their age to enlist, boys who'd grown up herding sheep, hauling water, living without electricity. Many had spent years in boarding schools where they'd been beaten for speaking the very language the Marines now desperately needed, and they volunteered by the hundreds. Think about that for a moment. The same government that had tried to erase their culture, that had stolen their children, that had forbidden their language, was now asking them to risk their lives, to fight, to bleed. And they said yes. Not for the government, for their land, for their people, for each other. One recruit, William McCabe, said it perfectly. We were told that we were the only ones who could do this, that our language could save American lives. How do you say no to that? But being Navajo wasn't enough. They still had to become Marines. Boot camp at Camp Elliott and later Camp Pendleton was designed to break men. 7 weeks of hell. Run until you collapse, crawl through mud under live machine gun fire, scale walls, forced marches with full packs in the California heat. The Navajo recruits were smaller than most Marines, leaner, and the drill instructors didn't cut them any slack. If anything, they pushed harder. But these young men had grown up in one of the harshest environments in America. They'd run for miles across desert. They'd survived on almost nothing. Physical hardship wasn't new to them. What was new was what came after boot camp, the code school. Because passing boot camp only got you in the door, now came the real challenge, creating a military vocabulary in a language that had no words for tanks, submarines, or grenades. Imagine the task. You need to describe modern warfare in a language that evolved in the American Southwest centuries before the Industrial Revolution. There's no word for bomber, no word for aircraft carrier, no word for reconnaissance, so they had to invent them. And this is where it gets brilliant. The first 29 code talkers sat down together and created a vocabulary from scratch. They used the natural world, animals, birds, fish, things every Navajo person would know. A tank became turtle, che-dagahi, slow, armored, impossible to stop. A bomber became buzzard, J-show, circling overhead, bringing death. A submarine became ironfish, beshlo. A battleship became whale, lotso. Grenades became potatoes, nimasi. They created over 400 military terms this way. Each one had to be memorable, had to make sense, had to be something that could be shouted in the chaos of combat without hesitation. But that was just the first layer. They also created an alphabet, because sometimes you need to spell out words letter by letter, place names, officer names, ship designations. So they assigned Navajo words to each letter. I became ant, Wolachi. B became bear, shush. C became cat, moasi. Actually, they assigned multiple words to each letter so that repeated letters wouldn't create patterns. A could be ant, apple, or axe. E could be elk, ear, or eye. This wasn't just clever. This was cryptographic genius. And here's the most incredible part. They couldn't write any of it down. Everything had to be memorized. 400 vocabulary words, the entire alphabet system, the alternates, all of it locked in their heads. If they were captured, the code had to die with them. The training was relentless. They'd receive a message in English, translate it into code, transmit it over radio while instructors blasted them with noise, and another code talker would receive it, decode it, translate it back. Speed was everything. In combat, you don't have time to think. The words had to flow automatically, and they did. Within weeks, these young Navajos were encoding, transmitting, and decoding complex military messages in under 30 seconds. Messages that would take cipher machines hours to process. But there was something else they had to prepare for, something darker. The military gave each code talker a bodyguard. Officially, these Marines were there to protect them. The code talkers were invaluable assets. If one was captured, the Japanese could potentially force him to talk, to teach them the code. But there was an unspoken second mission. If capture was imminent, if there was no way out, the bodyguard was ordered to shoot the code talker. Better dead than in enemy hands. Let that sink in. These young men volunteered to serve a country that didn't even grant them full citizenship in some states, and they did it knowing they'd been assigned executioners. But the danger didn't just come from the Japanese. The code talkers looked like the enemy. Black hair, brown skin, similar features. In the confusion of combat, American soldiers sometimes couldn't tell the difference between a Navajo Marine and a Japanese soldier. There are stories of code talkers nearly being shot by their own troops, of being attacked in camps, of having to be constantly accompanied by white Marines who could vouch for them. Chester Nez, one of the original 29, recalled being held at gunpoint by a nervous American sentry who was convinced he was a Japanese infiltrator. His bodyguard had to physically step between them. This was the reality. They were fighting two wars, one against the Japanese and one for recognition and survival among their own countrymen. By early 1943, the first waves of Navajo Code Talkers were ready for deployment. They'd passed boot camp. They'd mastered the code. They'd proven they could operate under pressure. Now came the real test, combat. The war in the Pacific was about to discover its secret weapon, a weapon the Japanese couldn't counter, couldn't intercept, couldn't break. 421 young Navajo men would serve as code talkers during World War II. They'd participate in every major Marine operation in the Pacific Theater: Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Palaleo, Saipan, Guam, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, every island, every beach landing, every brutal, bloody campaign. And in the chaos of those battles, while men died around them, while artillery shells rained down and bullets tore through the air, they spoke in a language their grandfathers spoke, in words that described turtles and whales and buzzards, and they changed the course of the war. Because sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't the biggest gun or the fastest plane. Sometimes it's a language that refused to die, spoken by warriors who refused to surrender, not their culture, not their identity, not their people. The Code Talkers were ready, and the Pacific would never be the same. August 7th, 1942, Guadalcanal, the first major American offensive in the Pacific. 20,000 Marines hitting the beaches of a jungle island most of them had never heard of, and among them, speaking quietly into radio handsets, were the first Navajo Code Talkers to see combat. Within hours of landing, the difference was undeniable. A Marine commander needed to call in artillery support, enemy position, coordinates, range. Ordinarily, this message would go to a cryptographer, get encoded using machines and code books, transmitted in Morse code, then decoded on the other end. 4 hours, minimum. The code talker picked up the radio and simply spoke. 20 seconds later, the artillery was firing. 4 hours became 20 seconds. In combat, that's not just an improvement. That's the difference between life and death. Officers who'd been skeptical became believers overnight. They started requesting code talkers for their units, demanding them. Because in the Pacific, where battles moved fast and communications could mean the difference between a successful landing and a massacre, speed was everything. The Japanese knew something had changed. Their intelligence officers were intercepting these transmissions constantly. They'd record them, play them back, analyze them with their best linguists. Nothing. One captured Japanese officer later admitted they'd brought in every language expert they had, specialists in dozens of Asian languages, European languages, even Native American languages. They thought it might be Navajo, but they couldn't be sure. And even if they were right, so what? There were no Japanese speakers of Navajo, no dictionaries, no Rosetta Stone. And this wasn't just Navajo anyway. It was Navajo describing turtles and whales and buzzards in patterns that made no sense, even if you could understand the words. The frustration in Japanese intelligence reports is palpable. The American messages continue to be indecipherable. For the first time in the Pacific War, America had a communication system the Japanese couldn't crack. Guadalcanal was just the beginning. Tarawa, November 1943. One of the bloodiest battles in Marine Corps history. A tiny atoll where Marines had to wade through chest-deep water while Japanese machine guns tore them apart. Code talkers were there, calling in naval gunfire, coordinating airstrikes, relaying casualty reports. Palaleo, September 1944. An island that was supposed to fall in 4 days. It took 2 months. Brutal cave-to-cave fighting in 100-degree heat. Code talkers transmitted constantly, their voices hoarse from shouting over artillery. Guam, July 1944. The liberation of the first American territory captured by Japan. Code talkers coordinated the entire 3-week campaign. Every island, every landing, every hell the Pacific could throw at them, and the code never failed, not once. But the ultimate test was still coming. February 19, 1945. Iwo Jima, 8 square miles of volcanic ash and rock. Mount Suribachi rising from the south end like a monument to death itself. The Japanese had turned the entire island into a fortress, 11 miles of tunnels, thousands of hidden bunkers and gun positions, 21,000 defenders who'd sworn to die rather than surrender. The Americans needed Iwo Jima desperately. It was the perfect base for fighter escorts and emergency landings for B-29 bombers hitting mainland Japan. But taking it would require the largest amphibious assault in the Pacific theater, and the largest deployment of Navajo Code Talkers ever. 13 Code Talkers hit the beaches that first day. Within a week, there would be more. The chaos was unimaginable. 70,000 Marines landing on beaches where volcanic ash swallowed their boots, Japanese artillery raining down from hidden positions, nowhere to hide, nowhere to run, and in the middle of it all, Code Talkers were transmitting air support requests, artillery coordinates, medical evacuations, supply requisitions, troop movements, enemy positions. In the first 48 hours alone, they sent and received over 800 messages. 800, without a single error. Messages that would have taken weeks to send using conventional codes were being transmitted in seconds. Major Howard Connor, the signal officer at Iwo Jima, said it plainly. Were it not for the Navajos, the Marines would never have taken Iwo Jima. Think about that. The most iconic American victory in the Pacific. The flag raising on Suribachi that became the most famous war photograph in history. None of it happens without those voices speaking in Navajo. One of those code talkers was a young Marine named Thomas Begay. On the third day of battle, his unit was pinned down by Japanese machine gun fire. Men were dying around him. The radio operator next to him took a bullet to the chest. Begay grabbed the radio. Shrapnel was flying. Bullets cracking overhead. He could barely hear his own voice, but he transmitted the coordinates. Called in the airstrike. 2 minutes later, Corsair fighters screamed overhead and obliterated the Japanese position. His unit advanced. Survived. Years later, Begay would say he didn't remember the words he spoke that day. It had become automatic. Instinct. The code and his native language had fused into something beyond thought. That's what made them unstoppable. The code wasn't something they used. It was something they were. Iwo Jima fell after 36 days. Nearly 7,000 Americans dead, 20,000 wounded. Every single Japanese defender killed or captured. And through it all, the Code Talkers kept transmitting. But victory came with a price that couldn't be measured in statistics. 13 Code Talkers were killed in action during World War II. 13 young men who volunteered to serve, who mastered an unbreakable code, who survived boot camp and combat training, but couldn't survive the war. Their families back on the reservation received telegrams. We regret to inform you. Standard military procedure. But the families couldn't be told what their sons had actually done. That was still classified, still secret. They died as ordinary Marines, their true mission unknown. But the dead were, in some ways, the lucky ones. The survivors came home carrying wounds that wouldn't show up on any medical chart. Today, we call it PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. Back then, they called it shell shock, battle fatigue, or nothing at all. The nightmares, the flashbacks, the survivor's guilt, the rage that came from nowhere. And for the Code Talkers, there was an extra layer of torture. They couldn't talk about it. Not to therapists, not to family, not to each other. The code was still classified, still secret. They'd been sworn to silence, so they carried it alone. Many turned to alcohol. Some couldn't hold jobs. Marriages fell apart. Some took their own lives. They'd saved thousands of American soldiers. They'd helped win the war in the Pacific. They were heroes, but nobody knew. And here's the cruelest irony of all. They came home to the same discrimination they'd left behind. In some states, Native Americans still couldn't vote, couldn't buy alcohol, couldn't testify in court. Code Talkers who'd fought across the Pacific, who'd bled for America, were denied service in restaurants, thrown out of bars, called savages. One code talker, returning home in uniform with combat decorations, was told he couldn't enter a diner in New Mexico. He'd fought for that land, nearly died for it, but he couldn't get a cup of coffee. They lived in two worlds, war heroes and second-class citizens, warriors and outsiders. And the one thing that might have made it bearable, the one thing that might have let people understand what they'd sacrificed, was locked away in classified files. For 23 years, they couldn't tell anyone. 23 years of silence. Imagine that. Imagine carrying that weight, that pride, that pain, and never being able to say a word. The Code Talkers had won the war, but the war wasn't done with them. August 15, 1945, Japan surrenders. Across America, there's celebration. Parades, ticker tape, sailors kissing nurses in Times Square. The war is over. The boys are coming home. The Code Talkers come home too. To silence. The military thanks them for their service, hands them discharge papers, and reminds them one more time, you cannot tell anyone what you did. Not your wife, not your children, not your parents. The code remains classified, top secret, because the Cold War is already beginning, and the military thinks they might need the code again, against the Soviets, against the Chinese, against whoever comes next. So, the Code Talkers go back to the reservation carrying a secret that's eating them alive. They'd been warriors, heroes. They'd saved thousands of lives, changed the course of history, but nobody could know. What do you do with that? How do you come home from Iwo Jima, from Okinawa, from hell itself, and just pretend you were an ordinary soldier? How do you explain the nightmares when you can't talk about what caused them? How do you deal with the guilt of surviving when your buddies didn't, when you can't even tell people their names? Many couldn't. The alcoholism that had always been a problem on the reservation got worse, much worse. Depression, rage, isolation. Some code talkers became violent. Some withdrew completely. Some just disappeared into themselves. Their families watched them suffer and didn't understand why. Didn't know what they'd done. Didn't know what they'd seen. One code talker's daughter later said, I grew up thinking my father was just angry all the time. Mean. I didn't understand. None of us did. We didn't know he was a hero. We just knew he was broken. 23 years. That's how long they carried it alone. 1968. Finally, the code is declassified, not because of any grand ceremony or recognition, simply because the military decided they wouldn't need it anymore. Modern encryption had moved on. So quietly, without fanfare, the most successful code in military history was released from classification. The Code Talkers could finally talk. But by then, who was listening? It wasn't headline news. There were no parades. Most Americans had never heard of the Navajo Code Talkers. Many of the Code Talkers themselves didn't even realize they could talk about it now. They'd kept the secret for so long, it had become part of them. Some never told anyone. They took the stories to their graves. It would take another 14 years before America started paying attention. 1982. The government declares August 14th National Navajo Code Talkers Day. It's a start, a small one. Finally, these men could stand up and say, this is what we did. This is who we were. But the recognition was still incomplete, still inadequate for what they'd sacrificed. The real turning point came in 2001, 56 years after the war ended. President George W. Bush presented the Congressional Gold Medal to the original 29 Code Talkers, or rather, to the 4 who were still alive. The rest received it posthumously. The ceremony in the Capitol Rotunda was deeply emotional. These elderly men, now in their 70s and 80s, some in wheelchairs, finally receiving the recognition they'd earned 6 decades earlier. John Brown Jr., one of the original 29, said through tears, "I never thought this day would come. I thought we'd all be forgotten." The families of the deceased code talkers accepted medals on behalf of fathers and grandfathers they'd barely known. Men who'd come home from the war and never spoke about it, never explained why they were different, why they were haunted. One granddaughter said, "My grandfather died when I was 12. I knew he'd been in the war, but that's all. Now I'm standing here, holding this medal, and I'm learning for the first time that he was a hero, that he saved lives, that he mattered. How do you grieve someone twice? Once when they die, and once when you discover who they really were." Today, there's a Navajo Code Talkers Museum in Bonito, New Mexico. There are monuments, documentaries, books. In 2002, the movie Wind Talkers brought their story to Hollywood, though Code Talkers themselves said it focused too much on action and not enough on truth. But at least people were paying attention. At least the story was being told. The last of the original 29 Code Talkers, Chester Nez, died in 2014 at age 93. The last Code Talker of any kind, Thomas H. Begay, died in 2024. The warriors are gone, only the story remains. But here's the final bitter irony. The language that won the war is now losing its own battle for survival. In 1945, virtually every Navajo spoke Navajo. It was the living language of a living culture. Today, fewer than 170,000 people speak it fluently, and most of them are elderly. Young Navajos are growing up speaking primarily English. The language is slipping away, one generation at a time. The same language that was beaten out of children in boarding schools. The same language that saved American lives in the Pacific. The same language that couldn't be broken by the best cryptographers in the world. That language is endangered. The irony is almost unbearable. We ask them to save us with their language, and then we let that language die. But there's hope. Inspired by the Code Talkers, there are now immersion schools on the Navajo Nation. Programs to teach young people their ancestral tongue, apps and online courses, cultural centers. People are fighting to preserve what the Code Talkers proved was invaluable. Because the lesson of the Code Talkers isn't just about cryptography or military strategy. It's about what happens when we try to erase cultures, when we decide that some languages don't matter, that some people don't matter. The United States tried to destroy the Navajo language for generations, and then, when America needed it most, that language saved us. The Code Talkers are gone now, but their legacy remains in every person who learns Navajo, in every child who grows up proud of their heritage instead of ashamed of it, in every documentary, every book, every memorial that says, "These men mattered. What they did mattered. Who they were mattered. They were warriors who defended their homeland with the very thing America had tried to take from them. They were heroes who served a country that didn't always deserve them. They were ordinary men who did something extraordinary. And they changed the world by simply speaking their truth, in a language that refused to die, in voices that still echo across the Pacific, in a code that was never broken. Because it was never just a code. It was a culture, a people, a legacy, and now, finally, we remember. So here's the incredible truth about the Navajo Code Talkers. The same government that punished them for speaking their language ended up needing that language to win the war. The code the Japanese couldn't break wasn't some complex machine or mathematical formula. It was a culture that refused to die. 421 young Navajo men proved something the world desperately needed to learn. The things that make us different aren't weaknesses. They're superpowers. Their language had survived Spanish conquistadors, forced relocation, and decades of systematic erasure. And when America needed an unbreakable code, that primitive language became the most sophisticated weapon in the Pacific. The Code Talkers saved thousands of lives. They helped win World War II. They changed history, not by becoming like everyone else, but by being exactly who they were. Today, the Navajo language is endangered. Fewer people speak it every year, which means we're in danger of losing the very thing that once saved us. The Code Talkers taught us that diversity isn't just beautiful, it's essential, it's survival. Every language we lose, every culture we erase, every unique voice we silence. We don't just lose history, we lose possibilities. Solutions, futures we can't even imagine yet. The next time someone tells you that being different is a problem, remember the Code Talkers. Remember that the problem saved the world. 421 warriors who spoke in turtles and whales and changed the course of history. Their code was never broken, and their lesson should never be forgotten.